All right, so we have stopped on page 86 and 87 in chapter 3, and we have been talking about different families. Let's see, we haven't talked about Indian families, just the way the gender roles work in Indian families, just very briefly. Indian families are patriarchal as well. So that means that you have male dominance. Women are the keepers of the home, and men go out and work. So that's the traditional, culture. Um, Indian culture is very, very ancient. Much of their gender roles are defined by their religious upbringing, essentially. Spirituality is a really big part of Indian culture, and so that kind of drives it home as well. Now, a really important feature that people have to understand is that a lot of times, the religious functions tend to drive the patriarchy as well. Women not really being a part of religious rituals is a pretty, significant part. From what I understand, and I'm not an expert in Hinduism or anything like that, women don't really participate much in religious rituals. Whatever happens at the temple and things like that, it's men primarily. So women kind of excluded, from that. Not seen as necessary, or I don't know quite how people rationalize it, but basically because their women are not encouraged to participate in religious festivals, not encouraged to be religious. They're just not encouraged to participate per se. Kind of stay at home, basically, kind of thing. But a lot of things that go on in the temple all include men, and so as a result to that, that again gives men very prominent role in society and creates that understanding that men are important and men are supposed to run things, or sort of say, and they're even the spiritual well-being of the family is dependent on men. So because it goes that way, their role is much more pronounced in a family. And an interesting feature about Indian families is that, according to the statistics, about 90% of all marriages in India are arranged marriages. Now, I don't know how much experience you have with arranged marriages, whether you understand them or not, whether you have a positive view or negative view of arranged marriages, but 90% of arranged marriages, it's a pretty big deal. That means majority of the people who are married did not pick their own mates. That means it came down to family. It came down to parents. Your parents brought you a mate and they said, this is who you're going to marry. And you said, yes, sure. Didn't really have a lot of, maybe, from what I understand, having spoken to people who are arranged marriages, people who come from that culture, there's quite a bit of say. Nobody forces you into a marriage. You do have to, but you go along with the choices that your family is making for you, essentially. Why? Because you respect them and you know them and you trust them and you know that they're not trying to hurt you, essentially. They're not trying to, if you think about it, most people that have a view of arranged marriages that's negative, it stems from the fact is that they feel like, I want to make my own choice. I like what I like and I want to get what I like, sort of say. And it's kind of a very selfish choice in the sense that, I don't really care what anybody else thinks. I want what I want. But in cultures that arrange marriages, it's seen in a very different way. It's seen in a very positive way. It's looked upon as like, my family does not want me to suffer. They don't want to hurt me. They're not trying to be mean to me. So if they're going to pick somebody for me, they're going to do the best job they possibly can, rather than try to hurt me. So it's like, that idea is a pretty big deal. So how people see, whether they see it negatively or positively. But anyway, it's an interesting fact about Indian marriages, and which again, kind of affects the role of men and women, of course. Globalization is also affecting Indian families in a major way, because there's lots of people in India. It's a very large population, and many do not live or work in India. So they're moving across the globe just like everybody else. And that disrupts that traditional family culture as well. So just like everybody else. All right, good. Arabs, there's a section here on Arabs, and I really like the fact that the authors of this textbook differentiate between Arabs and Muslims. This is really important. Most people don't understand that. Not all Arabs are Muslims, and not all Muslims are Arabs. That's very, very true. Very, very true. So it's not one and the same thing. Although for many Arabs, Islam is their dominant faith, and certainly a dominant part of their culture. And so Islam shapes a lot of people in a variety of ways. The teachings of Quran are, very pervasive, and so the Islamic culture kind of takes over a lot of those ideas. So a lot of people don't understand how pervasive Islamic culture is. For example, most people in Egypt, people think about Egyptians, right? Hieroglyphs, pyramids, all of that. So most people living in Egypt are Arabs. They're not actually Egyptians, not, ethnically, not genetically. Even if they were completely assimilated into the Islamic culture. And in fact, they don't really have any connection with the hieroglyphs or the paintings or the pyramids. Culturally speaking, they're completely foreign to them because it's the culture of the Quran that they know and they understand, and that is who they are. They don't think Egyptian, quote unquote, if there is such thing. Because when we study ancient Egyptians or something like that, there's clearly a very distinct, very unique culture. And it's nothing like Islamic culture at all. Completely different. Yet, most people in Egypt today are simply Muslims. That is the big part of influence on them. So in Quran and Islam, of course, there's a very patriarchal culture. In fact, one of the features that occur in Islam that is very, very pronounced, where they're in other groups maybe not so much, is the multiple wives. It is, again, goes back to the founder of Islam, Muhammad, and to others to have multiple wives, and it's very common. It's a common Middle Eastern thing to begin with, but Islam essentially made it in a very theological, organized system of saying, hey, this is how it works. Having sons is a priority. It's a big deal. Children in general are seen as a really big deal. The more children you have, the better. And so imagine if you have multiple wives, how many children can you have, right? So with one, you can hope for a few, right? But with 5 or 6 wives, you can hope for a whole entire clan. You can take over a city with that many children. That's the idea. So children are very, very much valued in that culture, and it's interesting that, again, it flows over into the family structure. If you really value children that much, then having multiple wives is really giving you what it is that you really value: more and more and more children. So and it allows you to move your family forward, which again is a very pragmatic thing, but that's what it is. So an interesting saying here that I note on page 87, it says, your wealth brings you respect, your sons bring you delight. You could see how something like that would be a very clear statement on male preference. Obviously, it's your sons. Why? Because you're wealthy and everybody respects you and thinks you're great, and that's good, but then your children, and more specifically your sons, they're the ones who bring you honor. You look at them and you say, wow, everyone respects my children. Everybody looks up to my children. I've really made it in the world now, And of course, if that happens in turn to them, then the whole family gets prestige and so on and so forth. So family prestige is a big deal. Family honor is a big deal in that part of the world. So let's see. Of course, men are the primary breadwinners. They're the earners. They're the decision makers. They're the disciplinarians in that culture. Whether we talk about Pakistan or Iran or Saudi Arabia, it doesn't really matter. For that matter, That is the general culture. Their gender roles are very traditional, with kind of women raising children and not really having much say. And you could see that even from the traditional Islamic dress, where women are completely covered up, right? So you no doubt you have seen a lot of women wear hijab, where they're completely covered. They're not supposed to express their individuality. They're not supposed to even present themselves to the world very much. So it's kind of like very, very private. So you could see even from clothing, from national clothing, from traditional clothing, how women have very, very different position in that world, in that society. And of course, I don't know if many of you heard or not, that in places like Saudi Arabia, women have to seek permission to drive. Actually have to ask permission to drive from their husbands, and from even sometimes from their brothers, from somebody like that. They have to have a permit to operate a vehicle, otherwise not allowed. So, which again, from your culture, that may sound really crazy, but for them, that's considered completely normal. So, again, it's just the role that women play in those families is very different, very subservient, very diminished role in the sense of power, in a sense of independence. Women are very seen as very dependent in that world, and that translates, of course, to communication as well. Everything that we're talking about is affecting how people communicate. Now, couple of more things to touch over here that's really important before we kind of rush through the rest of this. 88, 89, individualism, collectivism. We're going to talk a lot more about this as the book unfolds. But if you understand the primary ideas between individualism and collectivism, these are very key, important concepts. Okay. Basically, whether you're an individualist or collectivist is how your culture is going to force you into a particular way of understanding the world and acting. Okay. So in the individualistic culture, people are encouraged to be unique and independent. They are encouraged to be essentially completely on their own. You are part of a group, but it's all about you, essentially. Sometimes you're seen as you're kind of sovereign, you're standalone. We have saying in America, the man is an island, or something like that. Things like that, of that nature. So there's a tendency to independence and competition, and self-determination, pursuing your individual goals, independent living, and the I being the most important form of identity. So I'm just reading straight here from page 88, looking at our textbook. Now that describes a individualistic orientation culture. And the collective culture is a little bit different. They still value the individual, but there's a different approach. So the emphasis is on the needs and the goals of the group rather than the self. So it's not about us. It's not about me or I. It's we. It's us. These particular cultures that are more collective and more collectivistic, they value interdependence. They value group achievements, like what have we done as a group together, as a people. And interdependence is not looked upon as something as negative. Cooperation, and these things are stressed. Now, again, there's less competitiveness and there's less self-determination, because you're not focused on self, you're focused on others, and how you're much more focused how you fit into everyone else's life than everything being about you. And so as a result, these overarching values of individualism and collectivism, they do affect the family, because we're talking about the family right now. So if you have a family that is individualistic, there's certain things that are going to happen in your family versus the other way around. So because Americans, for example, are very individualistic. Americans are definitely on the spectrum of individualism. They're completely on one side here. You're going to see that a lot of American families are going to segment things. Like, for example, we already talked about nuclear family versus extended family. Most Americans see their family as nuclear family. Why? Because they're individualistic. It's all about me and the people who surround me right now, which would be, me and my parents. That's it. And like grandparents, they're their own family. Aunts and uncles, well, they have their own family, they have their own kids. They're not really truly a part of this household, and that's it. They have their own house, they have their own place, they live somewhere else. They're not this family, they're another family. So there's that feeling, okay? So the way you make decisions in family is, it's not based on a larger group, it's based on me. What do I want? What do you want to be when you grow up? Is an American question. What do you want to be when you grow up? A lot of people from collectivistic cultures, when they're asked that question, they're like, I want to be whatever my family wants me to be. That's what they would say. And it's a very American question. What do you want to be? Why? Well, because in American culture, you can be anything you want to be. You can achieve anything you want, because the way the culture functions is it pushes you to achievement, it pushes you to competitiveness, it pushes you to make something of yourself. And you can be nothing and you can become everything. You can build from nothing. And that's a value of America as a culture and as a country, essentially. And so it's possible. So people are doing it every day, and we see them do it. And we say, okay, I want to do the same. So it's basically, you have this idea of self-reliance. You're a self-starter. Everything you do is by yourself. You trust yourself. It's you yourself who are making yourself successful, essentially. And so your independence is valued. The fact that you're independent is very, very valuable. It's understood in families as, being able to be independent, being able to do things on your own, by yourself, for yourself, is highly valued, highly, prized a feature of a person's, personality, essentially. So in America, kids are encouraged to decide for themselves. What do you want? What do you want? Is kind of, they decide for themselves. They do their own things. They develop their own opinions. They're allowed to work out their own problems on their own. Now, that's America. Why? It's individualistic society. Why? Because it's all about you. And you are allowed to express those opinions as well. In collectivistic societies, you're not supposed to have your own opinions. You're not supposed to express your own opinions. You're supposed to ask what everybody else thinks. And you don't do what you want to do. You do what needs to be done or what other people tell you how to do. Again, because the orientation is not, oh, I want this, I want that. You're not independent. You're not seen as independent. You're not asked to be independent. You're not encouraged to be independent. So, so besides the United States, countries that are very, very individualistic are, for example, Germany, and Switzerland, and Canada, and Australia, and France, countries like that. There's some countries that are definitely on the other side of the spectrum, but these are countries that tend to be much, much, much more individualistic, where people prize those values, sort of say. Okay, so collectivistic families are quite different. They do value their interdependence. They actually find strength in their interdependence. They share everything, and a lot of times they live together. A lot of times they practice their religion, everything together. There's no such thing as individual practice of religion. Everything is done communally. So whether we're talking about meals or sharing things, so it's just a lot of this sometimes is economic. In America, people can be individualists because they can have big houses sitting on themselves. They They can afford it, and in a lot of other countries, people can't afford to be individualists. They have to share a house with somebody else. You have to have several families living within the same house, or houses have to be built into big buildings and their apartments, and you share, and you don't even have your own individual bathrooms, or you don't have your own individual kitchens. You can have several families sharing one kitchen, several families. So you could see how that pushes you towards not really being individualistic, but much more collectivistic, much more interdependent. What other people do affects you in a very powerful way. So, I mean, that's the other side of the spectrum. Basically, you will see this in other aspects of culture, where in the American culture, kind of this individualism is fostered and everyone is on their own. The collectivistic side, for example, will tend to try to band together in a much more cohesive way. You have families that move across the world and they still help each other out. They're like, oh, you're living 11,000 miles away from me now you're on your own. I can't really help you. Well, in a much more collectivistic mindset, oh, so-and-so needs money. All right, I'm going to send it to them. Where's Western Union? So you run to the Western Union, send them some money. You help them out. And sometimes they're like, oh, so-and-so doesn't have a job, so we're just going to send them money every month now. Why? Well, because we do right here. And so you do that. That's normal for collectivistic families. It's not very common or normal for individualistic families. So, again, how people work these things out is very different. A lot of collectivistic families, like for example in the Arab world, in the Middle Eastern world, you share everything. You share your house, you share your income, you share your expenses. A whole entire extended family works as one economic unit. One economic unit. You just put it all together, and then you share it. And again, that's for Americans, that would be very strange. That would be very, very strange. But that is how collectivistic families function. And because they function that way, they teach you these values, and they give you a sense of identity of you not being by yourself. And therefore, that teaches you how to communicate in a very specific way. So let's see. Okay, what else do I need to say? Well, needless to say, many of the Asian cultures are collectivistic by definition. So is India. So is most of the Middle East. Is very, very collectivistic. Those are the most collectivistic cultures that there are out there. So where some cultures are kind of in between, they're a blend of both, or they're more or less leaning this way and less leaning that way. You think of it as a scale. Some cultures are very individualistic. Some cultures are very collectivistic. And then there's a lot that are kind of in between. And that the question is, it depends on the question. So, all right. So you could see how families treat each other, what they do based on how, what gender roles are, who's in charge. One of the interesting features that the textbook notes here is for us is how they treat the elderly. So for example, in the United States, the elderly are not very well held in high regard. Now I'm going to say this is majority culture. Please don't misunderstand me. There's lots of people in the United States who have very high regard for their elderly. But as an American culture, by and large, elderly are not living with other families. They live by themselves. They have retirement homes. They have retirement communities. When I tell people about retirement communities in Florida, where just like an entire city of old people living together, riding golf carts, going out to eat, enjoying, life and things like that, most people are like, what? They can't understand that, because in their world, older people live with younger people all together in family. You don't separate them and send them off to live somewhere else in their own little house, riding golf cart and, enjoying the company of other old people. So it's just strange for people. It's just weird. But that's America. So, elderly youth is very highly prized and highly valued. and it's not even so much youth, but looking young is very important, which is why people color their hair and get surgeries done on their face and everything you can imagine. Anything to look young, okay? Anything to be perceived as young, because youth is where the value is. Growing old means becoming irrelevant, means becoming less. You don't contribute to the society much. You become more of a drain on resources. You don't give much. You don't work. You don't do this. You don't do that. So again, because America is very individualistic, the achievement factor, the competitive factor is really important. Once you get to that age where you're not achieving things, where you're not competing, where you're not, actively influencing things, well, you're not important anymore. And therefore, elders are looked upon as less important, Like it or hate it, take it or leave it, it is what it is. And that is the majority of a culture. And individualistic cultures tend to treat their elders that way. So the old people are a lot of times made fun of and things like that in cultures like that. There are all sort of caricatures and funny names are attached to them and things like that, where in other cultures, old people are very much valued, very much respected, and nobody would even dream of making fun of them. It just would be not just wrong, but hazardous because you will have people rise up on you, things like that. So let's see. Again, in the Latin American culture, of course, you have a lot of elders living in the families. They're integrated into the families completely 100%. So there's a constant interaction, and there's a lot of authority actually comes from older family members. So elderly actually have a decent amount of authority and say in how the family is run. They're there. They've been around for a long time, so they're always kind of have that place. In the Arab world, same thing. Elders are highly respected and how highly valued. There's a certain amount of reverence that even comes towards elderly people in the Arab culture. There's a prestige attached to them. So grandparents are really a huge deal in the Arab world. And so there's a belief in Islamic culture that you must absolutely have to care for your parents and your grandparents, because if you don't, that just makes you a terrible person. So and again, and that same type of value translates, from, again, Quran. And so respecting your elders and caring for them is a big deal. In Asia, the parents play a very crucial role, and grandparents as well. So if we talk about elders are to be respected, and that can even go down to sometimes the degree that other people would consider unhealthy. So there's let's see, there's old roots that Asian cultures have that goes to ancestor worship. So if you understand that, if you come from a culture that is at any time has engaged in ancestor worship, you're going to have elders being treated in your family in a very, very esteemed way. Because if you worship your ancestors, just imagine, that person sitting next to you is your ancestor. And they may not be dead, they're still alive, but you're going to have to give them reverence the same way as you do to your ancestors that have passed on in generations ago. So family honor is very important, and basically how a person treats their parents and grandparents relates to the person's quality of character automatically. It's like 100%. So again, in Asian culture, really big deal. Elders are almost venerated, almost to the point of pushing it. For Americans, that would be like going way, way, way too far. But it depends on where you are on the spectrum in your culture, where you're going to see that as excessive or not. So dishonoring your parent or grandparent can be a really big deal, and there's could be huge social repercussions and punishments that follow as a result, where a lot of other cultures would find that strange and weird, that you would even have social punishments coming for, not being good to your grandparents or something like that. Let's see, African traditions, same thing. You have really high regard for elders, but of course, you remember a lot of traditional African religions actually engage in ancestor worship. So again, that is deeply ingrained within the culture and even religious expression, where your ancestors guide you. Your ancestors can make things better for you or worse for you because they passed to the other side of life, and they can somehow influence the forces here while you're alive. So you better be good to them, because if you're not good to them now, well, they may get back at you later. So kind of, think of it that way. So those types of religious traditions certainly affect people. American Indians, very, very clear regard for ancestors, deep respect within American Indian culture, very, admiration. Again, they're seen as the clan leaders, and they're basically they're the keepers of oral traditions. So also keep in mind that a lot of societies that are not literate, a lot of societies that are very oral, elders play a different role because they actually preserve culture and keep the tradition, because none of those stories are written down. None of those songs are recorded. They all have to be passed on by somebody doing them, performing them, telling them. So the more oral your culture is, the more your culture transmits information in this kind of way, the more you actually rely on the elders to tell you the values of your cultures, the history, the stories, all of that. So you could see how that changes, the more you go into a culture with lesser, let's see, the less the literacy level, let's put it that way. A lot of times the higher the regard would be for the ancestors and elders in general. So, because there's a clear dependence there on these structures. African American families is another interesting dynamic. You have a culture that's sort of half American, half African, right? You have two values that are kind of battling each other out. So being in America, you have certain individualistic tendencies, but really having from a cultural African background, people have other tendencies, more tribal type tendencies that push them in that direction. So they kind of have a very interesting in-between scenario going on there. So grandmothers play a big role. Interestingly, in African American families, not grandfathers, but grandmothers in particularly. But then a lot of African American families are actually fractured. So there's a lot of broken up families where you have families without fathers and therefore without grandfathers, and so on and so forth. So the role of women in African American family is, to me, from my perspective, is much, much more emphasized than it is the role of men. And so it is what it is culturally. Again, in this class, we don't really make judgments of cultures, what is better, what is worse. We just simply observe them, discuss them, look at them, and say, this is different. It's different. So because we all have a cultural bias, a cultural perspective, and we got to keep it in check, because we're not trying to judge anybody's culture. We're just trying to say, this is what it is, and this is how it is. And I'm going to accept it as valid because that's how these people organize their life. So again, as we look through all these cultures, some of them strike you as strange and odd and unusual, and that's normal because they're not like yours. It just doesn't make them worse or better. It just, cultures are cultures. So, all right. So it is in the family that we learn all of our communication skills, all of our social skills, everything that happens, from treating elders to learning how to interact with other family members, how to be responsible. Most of the cultural functions that we have today, whether we're talking about communication, or we're talking about just daily functions, they come from family, and that's where these social skills are learned. So think of this. There's a few things that the authors mention over here that is worth mentioning just for fun, because I want you to think about how your family and how your family culture is affecting your culture. So, for example, Who gets to talk and when is it okay to interrupt in your family is taught completely innately by you being there and observing it. Some cultures, it's okay to interrupt. Other cultures, it's not okay to interrupt. In some cultures, it's okay for children to express their opinions and thoughts at the dinner table. In other cultures, they're not allowed to do that. They can say things, but they can't express their opinions and thoughts, especially if their opinions and thoughts are different, independent, and unusual from everybody else. Might not line up with what the head of the family thinks or something like that. So think about it. In some cultures, that is how it is. In some cultures, when you sit down for dinner, it's a big, huge conversation and everybody's talking and there's like 15 conversations happening at a dinner table. In other cultures, you're supposed to be silent and quiet, right? In some cultures, it's a big noisy event and everybody's talking and interrupting each other. Pass this, pass that. Can I have this? I want more of that. And then in other cultures, it's very reserved and very ordered, and so think about it. Just for fun in your family, who in a typical family from your culture, here's a meal being served. Who gets served first? Just for fun. I mean, who gets served first? Who gets it? Who gets it first? Mom, dad, kids, guests?
My family come from Germany culture, and normally first the elders and the kids.
Elders and the kids, and everybody else.
Yeah, okay. My Germany culture say, but Brazilian culture is a mess.
It's a mess.
The first, yes.
Good. Thank you, Addison. That's good. All right, anybody else who gets served first?
In my family, the first is the elderly, and then the adults, and then the kids.
See, the kids are last.
Yeah.
That's funny. Good. It's okay. It's all different. It doesn't mean anything. It just what meaning you put behind it. That there's meanings behind it, but it is what it is. It's just being it is. So, Hugh, in your family, how about that? Who gets served first? Hugh.
As my family?
Yeah.
Well, actually, for me, I try to say the elderly first. But in my family, is the elderly person is try to serve the children first.
Right.
It's kind of
right. Their value is to serve the kids, even if you want them to be first. They themselves don't want to be first.
Yeah,
which is okay. It's okay. It shows their value. But just think about in your culture, your family, and then your culture in general. I mean, is it typical or not typical? Because if you say it's typical, then I have to believe you. That's normal. Where the elders tend to be focused more on kids, but the kids, but everybody else, their own children want the elders to be the first. So he's kind of play that social game. Paul, what about you? Same thing or different?
I think this is the same thing, but I thought kids have to wait until the elders pick up their spoon and chopstick.
Good. That's good. That's awesome. This is nice. Okay, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else wants to join? Who's first in your family? You guys want to jump in on that? Fabio, what do you say?
It's the same thing for my family too. So the oldest would eat first, then children would eat second, I guess.
Okay. So oldest males or oldest females? How about that?
I don't know. Depends who gets first.
Depends.
It would be someone older though.
Okay.
So
kids are last. Good. That's fantastic. Thank you, Vance. I appreciate that. All right. So here's another question for you guys, just for fun. Silence. Do you guys eat in silence, or there's a lot of conversation that goes on? Are you allowed to have multiple conversations at a dinner table simultaneously, or does it have to be orderly? And is it supposed to be silent and everybody kind of eats and don't talk, or is it okay to talk a lot and for a long time?
I think in Brazil, we have a mix of cultures, and we have a lot of Italians, Germans, and
yes.
And I think we learn with the Italians, and when you have a meal, everybody talk together.
At the same time, yeah, because that's
Yeah, at the same
definitely
time.
Italian culture. That's definitely, and Brazil is a very multicultural society, so it's very difficult to peg Brazilians, because it
Yeah.
depends what kind of a Brazilian are you.
What kind of Brazilian?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I get it. So, but the tendency is to just kind of go back and forth, and so that's mostly typical. Majority of the people would go back and forth and have multiple conversations at their table, and even sometimes interrupt each other, talk over each other, right? Okay, good. I mean, I'll tell you, my dinner table, my family, like, everybody talks a lot, everybody talks with each other, and sometimes you carry on multiple conversations at the same time, and you do interrupt. But again, in my culture, it's considered normal. You know, we actually multitask in our conversations, and that's normal. But I have been in other situations where it has to be orderly. Only one person gets to speak at a time. They have to be acknowledged to speak. It's like you almost have to be recognized. It's like there's a social order at the table, and things like that. But a lot of times in my family, we do have forbidden topics, by the way. So I'll tell you this. In my family, most of the time, any kinds of conversation about computer games are disallowed at the table, for example. So it's like, on the Sabbath, business is not being discussed. You don't talk business. You don't talk deals. You don't talk anything. No politics is another thing. Things like that, because you're supposed to focus on more spiritual things. So sometimes the topics there's a social discouragement of certain topics. You don't discuss business. It's a temptation to get together with your friends and talk about business or politics, right? But then it gets people upset, and they start arguing, and that's the last thing you want to do. So you're like, you know what? These topics are off the table. We talk about other stuff, So sometimes that. So silence, the lack of silence. Who is allowed to talk? Think about your family, how you learn about humor, for example. I mean, you're being taught what's funny by your family. What your family laughs at is what you think is funny. Think about it. I mean, these are all part of our family socialization practices. You don't realize it, that you're being taught by your family what you think funny is, what kind of jokes are appropriate to tell, and what kind of jokes are not appropriate to tell. Things like that. Even you're being taught in your family. Verbal communication, nonverbal communication. How do you communicate? How much do you communicate verbally or non-verbally? It's also very cultural. Okay, from one culture to the other, certain families will have a lot of hand waving, handshaking, a lot of head motions, and everything you can imagine. Okay, facial expressions will change a lot based on how much do they use nonverbal communication. Well, other families, very straight, kind of not much alteration, not a lot of body movements, not a lot of facial changes, very restricted, sort of say, nonverbal communication. And you learn this from your family. You really do. How free you are to express those things in conversation, whether it's at the dinner table or any other time, just talking to each other, waving hands. So Mateus, there's about Italian people, they wave hands a lot. It sounds sometimes that if you're observing them that they're screaming at each other, but they're not. Like if you turn off the volume, like you mute and you watch them go at each other, you'd think they're fighting, right? But they're not fighting. If you actually understand what's going on in the situation, turn the volume back on, they're just fine. They're just having a passionate conversation. They're very involved. They're very engaged in what they're saying, and so they're emotional about it. But it doesn't mean they're fighting. So and now you observe people like that, and so how much they gesture, how much they express their facial emotions and things like that, and you learn that, and that is how you learn to communicate from your family. When is it okay to laugh? How much is okay to laugh? You know, what sort of laughter are you allowed to laugh? Can you laugh a big, huge belly laugh? Can you throw your, you know, head backwards and just laugh like crazy? Or are you supposed to cover your face when you laugh? Think about it. Is it okay in your family to express laughter in this open explosion, right? Or are you supposed to moderate your emotion? We're taught these things within families. And when we watched it, we behave it, and we continue to pass it on and teach it to our children. None of those things are right or wrong or moral or immoral or anything like that. It's just they're different, and they're different from family to family, from culture to culture. And so, of course, a lot of times, you know, families conform with the greater culture that surrounds them as well. So these kinds of things are, you know, part of our dynamic. So criticism, is, you know, in your family, who's allowed to criticize who, you know, and are you allowed to criticize people vocally? You may not like something, but you don't say it. Are you allowed to criticize? Are your kids allowed to criticize? You know, my kids, for example, feel that it is absolutely okay to criticize my wife's cooking, which I have to chastise them for every single day. But they feel very open. They're very Americanized in that sense. They express their strongly held opinions about liking or not liking something. And I have to get on them all the time, because my upbringing, my culture, you don't have that freedom, you know, to express as a child, you know, whether you like something or you don't like it. You eat it because it's put on in front of you, and that's it. You don't like it, you can stay hungry. kind of an idea. But that's the culture I come from. That's not the culture they come from. They come from culture. What do you want? And would you like a cherry on top? You know, would you like that on the side? Would you like that warmed up? Would you like it now or later? You know, it's just like there's so many choices. Everything is being catered to, you know, and that's a very normal American thing. So, you'll see that. These are the things we learn in our family. And then the social skills that we learn overflow into our communication skills. Okay, they overflow into our communication skills. So if I go out to a restaurant, a person would sit down and order a meal, right? So imagine this: a person would just say, "What would you like?" "Oh, I would like this and this and this." Good, done, simple. Now I have seen some people place an order in a restaurant, and it takes them 8 minutes. You know why? Because they're giving them instructions exactly how they want it, almost to the point of how they want it cooked, how they want it served. Now I want this done this way, and leave this side off. And when you do this, don't include that, and make sure this does not touch that. And they give these elaborate instructions. You know, essentially the waiter is standing over there writing a book of how to serve this person the meal they want to be served, and it has to be served in the exact way. And I want you to bring my salad out first, and then when this is done, make sure don't wait this long. And I'm like, okay, this is too much. This is too complicated. But that's culture. See, that's culture. The worst thing you can do is go out to a restaurant with a chef too. You know, because they'll tell the waiter exactly how to cook everything too. So I've had a few of those. All right, so our communication skills, hopefully you understand how they're flowing directly from that social dynamic of family and what we learn, and pretty much whether it be the dinner table or everything else, you know, in life. This is where we learn our assertiveness or our conformity. Some cultures are more assertive, others are more conformist, you know, and so what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say, how much of your individuality can you express, and to what degree, which behaviors are frowned upon and which behaviors are approved, things like that, you know, like picking up food and eating it before an elder does, like Vance, you know, was saying, or you know, or like Paul was saying, like, you know, eating it before the elder in the family begins to eat, or something like that, or, you know, starting to eat. So like all of that, you know, affects us because it teaches deeper lessons of culture. It teaches deeper lessons of what's proper and improper. And that also flows into communication, because if this is how you eat, then guess what? that is also how you communicate. It's the same values that transform to another area of life, essentially. So how assertive can you be? How, conforming are you going to be? Can you be impolite? When is it okay to be impolite? Is it ever okay to be impolite? Things like that. Can you say no? I think this is a very interesting point that the textbook actually makes here in this section. I'm reading page 99 right now. The avoidance of word no in Asian cultures is so strong. I've faced this myself many times, where people do not like to say no. They consider that to be a bad thing. Okay, Hyung is laughing because she knows exactly what I'm saying. It drives me absolutely crazy. It drives me crazy even till today. And I know about it, and I've known about this, and I've studied this, and I've watched this happen many times, and I still get caught in this thing where a lot of times that I deal with somebody from Asia, I will ask them to do something, and they will say yes, and they will agree, and they will never do it, but they will agree. And then I get mad at them for not doing it. Yeah, Hyun is laughing like crazy because she knows it's true. She knows it's true. I get mad at them for not doing it. Why did you say you were going to do this when you never wanted to do it, never intended to do it, but you said yes? Or at least you didn't say no. You kind of agreed with me, And this is where you learn that a lot of times in Asian culture, there's an aversion to saying no. People don't want to say no because no is considered impolite. So, people say yes because that's what you want to hear. Essentially, that's what will pacify you. People don't want to be combative. People don't want to be confrontational. So they just go along with what you're saying. And I tend to be very assertive, and I tend to be very direct in my communication. I guess this is a part of American culture. I've been Americanized in a major way as well. I tend to be direct. So I just tell people, what needs to be done, and they'll say yes, and then they don't do it. And I'm like, what's wrong with this picture? But so there's an avoidance of no. Now I know about it, and I still get caught in this trap of actually expecting, that from people. But there's a reason why. Again, in Asian culture, there's this sensation, there's this feeling, there's this understanding that you want to have some leverage in your speech, and so saying no is considered to be impolite because it's too direct. It's way too direct. So it's true. I've seen it many times, and if you haven't seen it yet, you will see it at some point. So, all right. That's pretty much the chapter that I wanted to highlight here with you. There's another final section over here that talks about developing competence, in your family. But that's more or less a nice list of suggestions. So that's what I wanted to highlight with you guys. So hopefully this has been an interesting class. Hopefully you learned something about yourself from all these. I know I ask you all these probing questions, which, the point of my question is not to torture you. The point of my questions is to help you see how much of what you're reading in this book really applies to your personal life and plays out in your daily life today. And how much all of these behaviors and life ways and customs and traditions and the way we are actually affect the way we communicate. It affects it all, in a very powerful way. So if you learn how to understand other people's cultures, if you learn how to understand how people are predisposed, people from various parts of the world, whether they're collectivists or individualists, what the patterns, sort of say, of their life are, you could start to expect certain patterns of communication from them as well. And you will come to a place where there's a lot less misunderstandings happen. It doesn't mean you'll eliminate it, but you will come to that place where you will have greater success in making sense of what people are saying or what they're not saying. So just because a person is not saying something, you know, that could be cultural as well. So, all right, excellent. Stop recording now.